The morning Grace showed up at Owen's apartment with mascara streaked down her face, a suitcase in one hand and a bottle of champagne in the other, he realized that sometimes the people you've known your entire life can still surprise you in ways that rearrange everything. He was 38, a drafting engineer who spent most of his days turning architectural sketches into technical plans, and Grace had been his best friend since they were 14 years old. They had grown up 3 houses apart on the same street, gone to the same high school, survived the same terrible prom, and stayed close through college, careers, relationships, and the quiet drift that happened when life got complicated. She was supposed to get married that Saturday. It was Thursday morning. Owen opened the door in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and stared at her. "Grace?" His voice was rough from sleep. She looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen, and said, "Let's run away." He blinked. "What?" She set the suitcase down, held up the champagne, and said it again, slower this time, like she was testing the words. "Let's run away, you and me. Right now." Owen stepped back and let her in because he didn't know what else to do. She walked past him into the living room, set the bottle on the coffee table, and sat down on the couch like her legs had just given out. He closed the door, set his mug down, and sat beside her. "Grace, what happened?" She stared at the champagne bottle for a long time before she answered. "I called it off." Her voice was flat, empty. Owen's chest tightened. "You called off the wedding?" She nodded. "This morning. I woke up, looked at the dress hanging on the back of my door, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't marry him." Owen had met her fiancé Derek exactly 3 times. He was a corporate lawyer, polished and confident in the way people are when they've never had to question whether they deserve the space they take up. Grace had seemed happy with him, or at least Owen had thought so, but he also knew that Grace was very good at seeming fine when she wasn't. "Does he know?" Owen asked. She let out a bitter laugh. "He knows. I told him an hour ago. He said I was being dramatic, that I was scared and that everyone gets cold feet. He said we could postpone, take some time, and I'd feel better." She turned to look at Owen, and her eyes were fierce. "I told him I didn't want to postpone. I wanted to stop. And he said, 'Grace, we've already paid for everything.' Like that was supposed to be the thing that changed my mind." Owen didn't say anything. He just waited. Grace took a shaky breath. "I've spent the last year planning a wedding I didn't want for a marriage I'm not sure I believe in, and the only person I wanted to talk to about it was you, but I couldn't, because you would have asked me the one question I was too scared to answer." Owen's throat felt tight. "What question?" She looked at him, and her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Why I was doing this." They sat in silence, and Owen thought about the last year. He thought about the texts Grace had sent late at night, always casual, always about nothing important. He thought about the times she had shown up at his apartment unannounced, claiming she was in the neighborhood even though she lived 40 minutes away. He thought about the way she had smiled when she told him about the engagement and how the smile hadn't quite reached her eyes. He thought about the question he had swallowed every single time, the one he told himself wasn't his business. "So why are you here?" he asked gently. She looked down at her hands. "Because you're the only person who has ever made me feel like I don't have to be anything other than what I am. Because I've been running towards something I thought I was supposed to want, and I realized this morning that I've been running away from the only person I actually miss when they're not around." She looked up at him, and her voice cracked. "I missed you, Owen. I missed you so much this whole year, and I didn't let myself feel it because I thought I wasn't allowed to." Owen's heart was pounding now. "Why weren't you allowed to?" She smiled, sad and small. "Because you're my best friend. Because we've been best friends for 24 years, and somewhere along the way, I started feeling something else, and I didn't know how to tell you. Because I thought if I told you and you didn't feel the same, I'd lose you completely." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "So I said yes to Derek because he was safe and easy, and he didn't make me feel like I was risking everything just by being honest." Owen leaned back against the couch and stared at the ceiling. His mind was spinning. He thought about all the years, all the inside jokes, all the late-night conversations and the comfortable silences. He thought about the way Grace laughed, the way she always ordered fries and then stole his anyway, the way she had shown up to his father's funeral and sat beside him without saying a word because she knew he didn't need words. He thought about how she was the first person he wanted to tell when something good happened and the first person he called when something went wrong. And he thought about the feeling he had buried so deep he had convinced himself it wasn't real. "I feel the same," he said. The words came out quiet, steady, and final. Grace turned to look at him, her eyes wide. "What?" He sat up and faced her. "I've felt the same for years, Grace. I just never said it because I thought you were happy and I didn't want to ruin what we had." Her breath hitched. "You're serious?" He nodded. "I'm serious. When you told me you were engaged, I was happy for you because I wanted you to be happy. But I also felt like someone had reached into my chest and taken something I didn't even know I was holding on to. Grace covered her mouth with her hand and fresh tears started falling. Why didn't you tell me? He smiled sadly.
Same reason you didn't tell me.
I was scared. She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. We're idiots. He reached over and took her hand. Yeah, we are. They sat like that for a long time, holding hands on the couch in Owen's messy living room while the morning light spilled through the windows. Finally, Grace looked at him and said, "So what do we do now?" Owen thought about it. "You said you wanted to run away?" She smiled, tentative and fragile. "I did, didn't I?" He squeezed her hand. "Then let's do it. Let's get out of here. Just for a few days. We'll figure the rest out later." 2 hours later, they were in Owen's truck heading north with no destination and no plan. Grace had changed into jeans and one of Owen's old hoodies, and she sat in the passenger seat with her bare feet on the dashboard, staring out the window at the highway rolling past. Owen drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the console between them. At some point, Grace reached over and laced her fingers through his, and he felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for years. They stopped at a small town 3 hours north, the kind of place with one main street and a diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 70s. They sat in a booth near the window, ordered coffee and pie and talked the way they always had, except now there was no pretending. Grace told him about the moment she knew she couldn't marry Derek, about waking up and realizing she was about to promise her life to someone who didn't actually know her. Owen told her about the night she had called to tell him about the engagement and how he had sat in his truck in a parking lot for an hour afterward trying to convince himself he was fine. "I'm sorry," Grace said quietly. Owen looked up from his pie. "For what?" She set her fork down. "For putting you through that. For not being brave enough to say what I felt." He shook his head. "You're saying it now. That's what matters." She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. They spent the next 3 days driving, stopping in small towns, staying in motels with flickering neon signs and beds that sagged in the middle. They hiked a trail that wound through pine trees and ended at a creek where the water was so cold it made their hands ache. They sat on the tailgate of Owen's truck under a sky full of stars and drank cheap wine straight from the bottle. They talked about everything they had been too scared to say for years, and they laughed more than Owen could remember laughing in a long time. On the third night, they were sitting on the porch of a small cabin they had rented near a lake, wrapped in blankets because the temperature had dropped and neither of them had thought to pack warm clothes. Grace leaned her head on Owen's shoulder and said, "I don't want to go back." Owen looked down at her. "We have to eventually." She sighed. "I know, but when we do, everything's going to be waiting. My family's going to have questions. Derek's going to want to talk. People are going to judge me for calling it off 2 days before the wedding." Owen wrapped his arm around her. "Let them judge. You did the right thing." She looked up at him. "How do you know?" He smiled. "Because you're here, and you're not pretending anymore." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Can I ask you something?" He nodded. She hesitated, and then she said, "Are you trying not to kiss me?" Owen's heart stuttered. He looked at her, at the way the lamplight from inside the cabin lit her face, at the way she was looking at him like she was giving him permission to stop holding back. "Yes," he said. She smiled. "Why?" He swallowed. "Because I didn't want to rush this. Because I wanted to make sure you were sure." She shifted closer, her face inches from his. "I'm sure." He kissed her then, slow and careful, and she kissed him back like she had been waiting for it just as long as he had. When they finally went back home a week later, everything was exactly as messy as Grace had predicted. Her mother cried. Derek called repeatedly until she blocked his number. Friends took sides. But Grace didn't waver. She moved into Owen's apartment temporarily, then permanently, and they built a life that looked nothing like the one she had been planning. 6 months later, Owen came home to find Grace sitting on the couch with a small wooden box in her lap. She looked up when he walked in, and she was smiling. "I found this in your closet," she said. He walked over and saw that it was the box where he kept old photos, ticket stubs, and things he couldn't bring himself to throw away. She pulled out a photo from their high school graduation, the two of them standing side by side, arms around each other, grinning. "We were so young," she said softly. Owen sat beside her. "We were." She set the photo down and looked at him. "Do you ever wish we'd figured this out sooner?" He thought about it. "Sometimes, but I don't think we would have been ready. We had to get it wrong first." She leaned against him. "That's a good way to look at it." He kissed the top of her head. "I learned it from you." A year after that, on a Saturday that was supposed to have been her wedding day to someone else, Owen asked Grace to marry him on the same porch where they had first kissed. She said yes, and then she laughed and said, "I'm glad I ran away." He grinned. I'm glad you ran to me. What would you have done if your best friend showed up at your door, heartbroken and asking you to run away with them, and you realized in that moment that you'd been in love with them the whole time? And have you ever walked away from something you thought you wanted only to find the thing you actually needed was waiting for you all along? Tell me your story in the comments. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.